Hello, it's Becky Ross here for my third and final contribution to my module on sex work under COVID-19 for the COVID and Society course in sociology. We'll begin with two introductory slides. Sex work under COVID-19, stigmatization, criminalization, and resistance by organizers. Part 3, sex workers under COVID-19, perils and possibilities. So let's commence with 4 guiding questions. In the context of COVID-19, how are sex workers navigating the pandemic? How have sex workers become uniquely vulnerable personally, economically, and socially? And why should we care? What can we learn about sex workers' rights as labor rights from the case of New Zealand in 2020? And will there be opportunities for some sex workers to expand and enrich their online business safely during and after the pandemic? Over the past 2 years in my sexualities course, Sociology 369, 5 students have come out to me as sex workers, dancers, escorts, and sugar babies. So I have learned that this knowledge is very relevant to the student population at UBC and at other post-secondary institutions. Sex workers navigating COVID in Canada. The vast majority of sex workers lost most, if not all, of their income overnight due to COVID-19. Concerns about transmission of the virus have slashed demand and workers' incomes, escorting, porn, exotic dancing, and other activities. Many workers have also lost intellectual and intimate companionship with regular clients. An estimated 2,600 sex workers work across subsectors in Vancouver, which is a sizable workforce. 15 to 20% do survival sex work, which means that they exchange sexual services for money to pay the rent, meals, or drugs. Many sex workers in Canada do not qualify for or are afraid to apply to emergency government benefits. There's the fear of increased stigma. Elements of the business are still criminalized. There's the fear of arrest, negative publicity, discrimination, eviction, seizure of assets, and deportation. Massage parlors in Vancouver have been forcibly closed, and single-room occupancy hotels have banned guests to limit the spread of the virus. So most at-risk sex workers have few safe spaces to meet clients or dates. Eligibility barriers faced by sex workers are numerous. If they have not earned $5,000 in the past 12 months, if they have not filed taxes annually, if they are a migrant or undocumented worker. Longtime sex work advocates Carrie Porth with Pivot Legal Society and Susan Davis with the BC Coalition of Experiential Communities in Vancouver have noted that dire circumstances are pushing sex workers to take more dangerous appointments, risking their health and safety to provide food and shelter for themselves and loved ones. Susan Davis also advises colleagues to avoid kissing for all dates, and she has recommended ways of reducing risks, such as using a glory hole, a hole cut in a wall or a plastic drop sheet to work with male clients with limited physical contact. Sex workers paid through e-transfers fear risking clients' confidentiality when they are expected to supply banking information to the state. Those forced to keep working face increased personal risk, and there have been increased reports of bad dates in Vancouver and Victoria. Emergency funds have been allocated to shelters, sexual assault centers, and frontline organizations, but not to sex workers directly, unlike other workers who have lost jobs and earnings. Let's recall that no official political party in Canada has supported sex workers' rights as human rights and labor rights. State officials have not made sex workers' financial security a priority during COVID-19. Some sex workers have argued that their work should be classified as an essential service, to which we will return at the end. In Vancouver in March 2020, Pace Society, a sex worker rights organization, devised a sex worker relief fund to distribute emergency financial relief to sex workers in Metro Vancouver. Importantly, applications for funding are reviewed by a committee of sex workers. Funds are distributed by e-transfer or cash. COVID has been particularly damaging for sex workers who are living in poverty and are unhoused or precariously housed, as well as Black, Indigenous, people of color, trans, disabled, and street-based sex workers who are already hit hardest. They are unable to meet basic needs such as food, medicine, childcare, and rent. And over a 2-week period, Pace Society crowdfunded and provided more than $20,000 to 147 Vancouver-based sex workers. In Toronto in March 2020, Maggie's Sex Worker Action Project and Butterfly for Asian and Migrant Sex Workers crowdsourced $80,000 as well for relief benefits. A GoFundMe campaign is a short-term mutual aid crisis management strategy. It is not a sustainable solution to helping sex workers survive the COVID crisis. So let's review some points made by Anna Louise Sussman in The Guardian in April of 2020. After decades of work with politicians, police, and health professionals, sex work activists in New Zealand's Prostitutes Collective achieved the decriminalization of sex work in 2003. As of March 2020, an estimated 3,500 sex workers in New Zealand with a national ID number became eligible for emergency wage subsidies and job seekers benefits. As Sussman explains, part-time workers received a lump sum of 4,200 New Zealand dollars for 12 weeks of lost work. Full-time workers received a lump sum payment of $7,029 over the same period of 12 weeks. It's also the case that in Thailand, where sex industry generates $4 to $6 billion annually, sex workers are eligible for unemployment benefits and assistance grants under the government's pandemic relief package. For 2 decades, New Zealand police have been trained to be sex workers, advocates, and allies. This has certainly not been the case for most sex worker police relations in jurisdictions around the world. And in New Zealand, sex workers sidelined during the COVID crisis are enrolled in university courses, messaging clients, doing justice-related volunteer work, and preparing to re-enter the business. I have chosen one uplifting example of sex workers' ingenuity, creativity, community spirit, and determination. It is in Portland, Oregon. Beginning in March 2020, exotic dancers at the Lucky Devil Lounge pivoted to food delivery called Boober Eats to earn their livelihood. Boober Eats workers delivered food and beverages in Portland, Oregon from the club during the pandemic. And there is a short video of 2 minutes and 30 seconds to view. And after having viewed it, let's reconvene and discuss these 2 questions. How does this clip unsettle negative stereotypes about dancers and club owners during the COVID crisis? And what more can we learn about the shifts and pivots being made by sex workers to earn money safely during the COVID crisis? For me, what is noteworthy in the clip, among other things, the dancers are independent contractors. They don't qualify for state funds in Oregon during the pandemic. They're working in pairs and with a driver. They're wearing boots, Doc Martens, and not stiletto heels. They're urban warriors taking measures to protect themselves and customers, wearing gloves, antibacterial gel, bringing joy, I should say, to the doorsteps of customers, some of whom are regulars at the club. And the ones pictured in the video and in the photograph are all white and young, which does raise significant questions about inclusion and exclusion. I'd also like to draw your attention to a range of other sex rebels from LGBTQ2S communities innovating during COVID. So just one example of drag queens here, Frida Wales and Ginger Snap, who began delivering food and wine to customers when the LGBTQ2S bar Friends of Dorothy closed in Kelowna, BC in late March 2020. So they are former workers at the club, which they hope will reopen at some point soon. Friends of Dorothy is known as the first queer bar in the Okanagan. Celebrity drag queens Latrice Royale and Gia Gunn are moving performances online during the COVID pandemic, and both performers were involved in RuPaul's Drag Race. In addition, burlesque troupes have also begun to make some efforts to think about monetizing their labor by going online. This is the Chocolate City Burlesque and Cabaret, an all African-American burlesque and variety troupe. And then also Virago Nation, which was formed in Vancouver in May of 2016, an all Indigenous burlesque troupe. So what are options for sex workers who want to monetize online sex work. While dancers, porn workers, escorts, and brothel workers hope to return to work post-COVID, most sex workers around the world are transitioning to online work, in part to comply with social and physical distancing rules. Sex workers are selling online subscriptions for streaming explicit sexual content, virtual strip show, virtual lap dancing, masturbation, sexy photos, sex acts with partners, and sexual storytelling. Sex workers face barriers to advertising and streaming sexual content online. Websites such as Backpage and sections of Craigslist have been closed due to allegedly promoting sex trafficking. Many sex workers experience discrimination by banks and payment processors like CC Bill, which charges $1,000 per year in fees. And in April 2018, US President Donald Trump signed new legislation which further marginalized sex workers, FOSTA, or Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act, and the Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act, or SESTA. Both acts have made it harder for sex workers to earn income online. It's also the case that Instagram and Twitter platforms are increasingly banning sex workers' accounts. Then in 2016, the site OnlyFans helped some sex workers shift online with advantages and drawbacks. Here's the OnlyFans sign-up webpage, and I wanted to introduce the work of Angela Jones, who is an African-American feminist scholar. She explores issues of camming, money, power, and pleasure in the sex work industry in her new book. She argues for a sociology of pleasure. Jones shares findings from her 5-year mixed methods study of the billion-dollar global industry of erotic webcamming. So we might ask, well, what are some of the advantages and drawbacks of online work for sex workers? From Jones and others, I have learned that online work is safer during COVID and ensures for some an income stream. Online cammers or cam models experience intimacy, creativity, community, empowerment, and pleasure in the course of their work. And sex workers with big audiences online before COVID have benefited the most from an online pivot. Drawbacks include a sex worker with a less established online client base must compete with others when sexually explicit websites become saturated. Again, it tends to be young, white, heterofeminized, thin, able-bodied cis women who have had more success selling sex acts, arousal, and fantasy online due to heteronormative, ageist, ableist, and racialized beauty conventions. It is not always easy to establish and maintain boundaries with clients online. Startup costs are expensive, including purchase or rental of webcam, studio lights, high-speed internet, sex toys, and costumes. These costs are sizable and lead to further stratification of the sex industry, which I introduced in part 1 of this module. Online sex work can be isolating and stigmatized. Workers experience vulnerability to abuse from trolls, and there is certainly a toll on the worker's self-esteem and mental health. And then finally, OnlyFans platform takes 20% of the worker's income made on the site. So by way of summary and concluding thoughts, the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed deep-seated fragility and precarity, as well as savvy, resilience, and ingenuity of sex workers. As noted in part 1 of this module, the global movement of sex workers for decriminalization and destigmatization has expanded in scope and influence over the last 50 years. Sex workers are demanding labor rights and human rights. And many are also continuing to explore the benefits of unionization. Sex workers and clients are still being harassed, arrested, bullied, and fined by law enforcement, just as they were over 100 years ago, as evidenced through our analysis of early 20th century prison records in part 2 of this module. So fundamental changes are still needed to ensure sex workers' safety and security locally and globally. Indigenous, Black, and other folks of color in the sex industry continue to face the most vulnerability, and they are also among the fiercest agitators for social and economic justice across institutional contexts. Sex workers during COVID-19 are joining the larger conversation about implementing a basic annual income or universal guaranteed income in Canada. In the post-pandemic era, we would do well to listen to the voices of all essential workers, including long-term care aides, hospital workers, anti-violence counselors, and other frontline responders. Sex workers could very well be reclassified as essential workers. The sex education, companionship, knowledge, skills, pleasure, and therapy that they provide can be life-saving, life-enriching, and nourishing in a world where loneliness, depression, and despair have taken hold for so many. A final thought. When you meet a sex worker, and you will, please be curious, respectful, open-hearted, and accepting. Be critical of racialized whorephobia, dead hooker jokes, and all criminal penalties. And make an effort to be an ally in solidarity. You never know when you might consider entering the business, either as a worker or a client, or both. Thank you so much for listening, learning, and participating in my module. I wish you all the very best with your studies in the course and at UBC into the future.